In a luxurious mansion, where everything seemed perfect, an elderly woman began to lose her freedom under the guise of family care. What appeared to be a gesture of affection turned out to be a cruel strategy to isolate and silence her. But the arrival of an attentive caregiver exposed a sinister plan involving control, manipulation, and a lethal attack. When the truth exploded before her own son's eyes, a turning point transformed silence into justice. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We're continuing. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear in your life. The mansion stood imposing in the most exclusive neighborhood of Beverly Hills, California, surrounded by high walls that seemed to protect secrets more than wealth. The impeccably maintained gardens displayed imported rose bushes and marble fountains that reflected the golden light of dusk. Security cameras watched every corner of the property, recording even the movement of leaves in the wind. To those observing from outside, it was the perfect abode of a successful family, a symbol of achievement and prosperity. But the truth, as always happens, hid in the shadows that the light couldn't reach. Richard Vance was a 48-year-old man, owner of one of the largest import and export companies in the country. His name circulated in the economy pages of major newspapers. His photo graced the covers of magazines specializing in international business. With a calculated smile and carefully chosen words, he had built an impeccable public image. He participated in charity dinners, sponsored social projects, and, in interviews, spoke with apparent emotion about the importance of family. His employees respected him, his partners admired him, and his competitors feared him. Richard mastered the art of appearing exactly what people wished to see. 3 years earlier, after a discreet divorce that was settled with million-dollar agreements and absolute media silence, Richard met Helen Drummond at a corporate event at the Shard Hotel. She was everything he sought to complete the image he wished to project. Tall, elegant, with impeccably brushed brown hair and a smile that charmed any audience, Helen worked as an image consultant for executives and politicians. Her talent lay in polishing appearances, transforming public personas and creating convincing narratives. She knew exactly how to behave in every environment, which words to use in every context, and how to manipulate perceptions without anyone noticing her strategy. Their courtship was brief, calculated, and efficient. 6 months later, they married in a luxurious ceremony at the Blenheim estate in Oxfordshire, with 300 guests, renowned musicians, and photo coverage that would be published in major society magazines. Helen embraced her role with mastery. On social media, she shared seemingly spontaneous moments of their life together, always with inspiring captions about love, complicity, and partnership. At public events, she held Richard's arm with the exact dose of affection and discretion. She was the perfect wife for the perfect businessman. But Helen had plans that went far beyond merely being Mrs. Vance. From the beginning, her goal was to consolidate herself as the true mistress of that mansion, of the fortune, and of every decision made within those walls. And there was a significant obstacle in her path. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, Richard's mother, an 82-year-old widow, still lived in her apartment in Belgravia, maintaining her independence and sharp lucidity. The matriarch had never hidden her distrust of her new daughter-in-law. From the first introductory dinner, her observant eyes caught something no one else seemed to notice. Helen didn't love Richard. Helen loved what he represented. For almost 2 years, Richard visited his mother weekly, bringing flowers and spending a few hours in her company. Mrs. Eleanor tried gently to make her son see what she saw so clearly, but Richard was blinded by the convenience of that marriage, by how Helen complimented his public image, and by the peace of mind of having someone so competent managing the social aspects of his life. He interpreted his mother's concerns as natural resistance to any woman who occupied the place that had once belonged to his first wife, the mother of his 2 grown children living abroad. Everything changed one March afternoon. Richard arrived at his mother's apartment for his weekly visit and found her sitting in the living room with a distant look. The housekeeper who had cared for Mrs. Eleanor for 15 years had abruptly resigned without giving convincing explanations. The matriarch seemed more fragile, more silent. It was Helen who suggested with perfectly theatrical concern that perhaps it was time for Mrs. Eleanor to come live with them in the mansion. "She needs constant care, Richard. The house is huge, we have staff, and that way you'll be able to be close to her every day. We can't leave her alone at this age. Imagine if something happens and there's no one around." Helen's voice was sweet, laden with rehearsed compassion. Richard hesitated for only a few seconds. The idea made sense. The guilt of not being able to be present every day due to constant international trips weighed on his chest. He looked at his mother, who remained silent, and made the decision. Mrs. Eleanor would move to the mansion in Beverly Hills. Helen celebrated internally. The piece was positioned exactly where she wanted it. The move happened within a week. Mrs. Eleanor arrived with her worn leather suitcases, her antique books, and the framed portrait of her late husband. The room prepared for her was on the second floor, away from the couple's master suite. It was spacious, well decorated with a view of the garden. It seemed welcoming. But Mrs. Eleanor felt, from the very first moment she crossed that door, that she was entering a golden cage. Helen greeted her mother-in-law with hugs and kind words, showing her every corner of the room, explaining where her clothes and belongings would go. But there was something in Helen's eyes, a cold glint that Mrs. Eleanor recognized immediately. It wasn't care. It was control. At dinner that first night, Helen personally served her mother-in-law's plate, commenting on the importance of a balanced diet in old age. Richard smiled, proud of the attention his wife dedicated to his mother. Mrs. Eleanor merely thanked her in a low voice and ate in silence, feeling the invisible weight of a surveillance that began there. The first few days were for adaptation. Mrs. Eleanor woke up early as she had done her whole life and went down to the garden to walk among the flowers. But she soon realized she couldn't move freely through the house. Helen always appeared with some excuse. "Oh, Mrs. Eleanor, don't go to Richard's office. He's in an important virtual meeting. Better not go into the kitchen now. The staff are preparing something special. This corridor is under maintenance. It's dangerous." Each day, more spaces became forbidden. The enormous mansion transformed into a labyrinth of restrictions. Mrs. Eleanor's attempts to have private conversations with her son were systematically interrupted. Helen always emerged with some urgency, some matter that needed Richard's immediate attention. When he traveled, her mother-in-law became even more isolated. The long-standing staff of the house, those who had worked for Richard before the marriage, began to be replaced. First the cook, then the gardener, then the cleaner. Helen justified each dismissal with plausible reasons. "They're getting old. They can't keep up with the work anymore. We need more efficient people." Richard, always busy, signed the documents without questioning. In their place, new staff arrived, all young, all recommended by Helen, all absolutely loyal to her. Mrs. Eleanor noticed how they changed their posture when Helen entered the room, how their conversations abruptly ceased, how they avoided her gaze. She was surrounded by strangers in a house that should also be hers. The isolation grew like a silent shadow. At night in her room, Mrs. Eleanor often held her husband's portrait and talked in silence. How she wished she could ask for advice, to hear that firm voice that had always guided her through difficult decisions. But now she was alone, trapped in a situation she couldn't fully explain even to herself. There were no shouts, no physical violence, nothing concrete she could point to. It was just an oppressive atmosphere, an invisible siege that tightened more each day. 2 months had passed since Mrs. Eleanor moved into the mansion. Autumn began to tint the garden leaves with orange tones, and the mornings grew colder. The matriarch's routine was now rigidly controlled, though no one openly admitted it. Helen had set schedules for everything. Breakfast at 8 sharp, supervised walk in the garden at 9:30, lunch at noon, mandatory afternoon rest, dinner at 7. Any attempt to deviate from this schedule was subtly discouraged. But the most worrying control concerned her medication. Mrs. Eleanor took pills for high blood pressure and, to control a mild cardiac arrhythmia, old and stable prescriptions that she knew perfectly. For years she had managed her own health with discipline and knowledge. However, as soon as she moved into the mansion, Helen took over this responsibility. It was Richard who asked, believing that his wife would help his mother not to forget any dose. Mrs. Eleanor tried to explain that she never forgot her medication, but her son had already agreed with Helen, and contradicting them would only cause more tension. Helen kept all the medication in a locked cabinet in the couple's bedroom. Every morning and night, she herself brought the pills to Mrs. Eleanor with a glass of water and a mechanical smile. Her mother-in-law began to notice changes in how she felt. Some days she woke up with a strange drowsiness that lasted for hours. Other days she felt inexplicable dizziness that forced her to sit down. When she mentioned these symptoms to Richard, he immediately suggested making a doctor's appointment. But Helen was quicker. "It's normal at this age, Richard. The body doesn't work as it used to. I'll adjust her medication schedule. Maybe it's just a matter of a slower metabolism." "Trust me, I took care of my own mother for years before she passed away. I know exactly what to do." Richard believed her. He always believed Helen. And Mrs. Eleanor realized that her complaints would always be interpreted as natural weaknesses of age, never as signs of something wrong. One morning she tried to refuse one of the pills Helen offered her, saying she didn't recognize it. Her daughter-in-law smiled with exaggerated patience, as one would speak to a stubborn child. "Mrs. Eleanor, you're confused. This is the same one you take every day. I'll write everything down for you, so you don't have to worry anymore. Your memory isn't what it used to be, is it? It's important to trust those who care for you." Those words echoed in Mrs. Eleanor's mind. Trust those who care for you. But what if those who care don't have good intentions? Doubt was a constant weight in her chest. She began to pretend to swallow the pills and then discreetly spit them into a tissue. She kept everything in a small box hidden inside her sock drawer. She needed proof, something concrete in case she could one day make Richard see the truth. The days dragged on with suffocating monotony. Mrs. Eleanor rarely saw her son. Richard left early for the company and returned late, often directly to his home office to deal with urgent matters. When they dined together, Helen dominated the conversation, telling elaborate stories about her day, about projects she was developing, about important people she had met. Richard listened attentively, impressed by his wife's active social life. Mrs. Eleanor was just a silent presence at the end of the table, served by staff who avoided her gaze. One evening, after dinner, Mrs. Eleanor mustered her courage and asked to speak to her son alone. Richard agreed, but Helen interrupted with venomous delicacy. "Oh, darling, before I forget, I need to show you those documents about the ballroom renovation. These are urgent decisions. The architect needs an answer today. Can it be quick now? Then you can talk to your mother calmly." Richard apologized to his mother and promised they would talk the next day. But the next day never came. There was always something more urgent, some unmissable meeting, some last-minute trip. Helen was a master at creating invisible obstacles, at diverting attention, at postponing conversations that could threaten her control. Mrs. Eleanor felt like a prisoner in a cell without bars, watched by eyes that never blinked. It was on a rainy June afternoon that something changed. Richard had traveled to Tokyo to close a large import contract and would be away for 15 days. Helen was particularly cheerful that morning, humming as she supervised the staff. Mrs. Eleanor noticed that, in her son's absence, her daughter-in-law didn't even bother to feign kindness. Her tone became colder, her orders more direct, her gaze more cruel. That afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor dared to leave her room outside the established hours. She carefully descended the stairs, holding onto the railing, and headed to the library. She just wanted to grab a book, something to occupy the long hours of solitude. But as she opened the door, she found Helen sitting at the mahogany table, talking on the phone. The voice was low, but the tone was unmistakably calculating. "Yes, everything is going according to plan. The old woman is completely isolated. No one believes anything she says. A few more months and she'll be so debilitated that anything could happen. Richard suspects nothing. He's too busy to pay attention." Helen paused, listening to the person on the other end of the line, and then laughed, a humorless, mechanical laugh. "Don't worry, it will look completely natural. No one will question anything." Mrs. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. She recoiled slowly, trying not to make a sound, but her shoes creaked on the wooden floor. Helen turned sharply, and her eyes met her mother-in-law's. For a second, the mask dropped completely. There was no kindness, no care, no humanity in that gaze, only coldness and threat. Helen calmly hung up the phone, stood up and walked over to Mrs. Eleanor. "You should be resting in your room, Mrs. Eleanor. You know you can't walk around the house alone. What if you fall? What if something bad happens? Richard would never forgive me. Come, I'll escort you back." The voice was soft, but the words were coated in poison. As they went up the stairs, Helen held Mrs. Eleanor's arm with unnecessary force. When they reached the room, she practically pushed her mother-in-law inside and closed the door firmly. Mrs. Eleanor heard the key turn in the lock. She was locked in. She ran to the door and tried to open it, but it was useless. She pounded her fists, called out to the staff, but no one appeared. She was trapped in her own room. Hours later, when it was already night, the door was unlocked. Helen entered with a dinner tray and her usual fake smile. "Sorry for the misunderstanding, Mrs. Eleanor. The lock just jammed. These old doors sometimes do that. I've already called a technician to check it tomorrow. You must be hungry. I brought your dinner. Eat everything. You need to keep your strength up." Mrs. Eleanor looked at the tray and didn't touch the food. Her heart pounded. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out. She needed to talk to Richard. She needed to make him understand the danger she was in there. But how? Helen controlled everything. The room's landline phone had been removed weeks ago under the excuse of maintenance. Her cell phone had mysteriously disappeared, and when she asked for a new one, Helen said she had already ordered one, but it was taking a long time to arrive. Mrs. Eleanor was completely isolated from the outside world. That night she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the mansion, the wind rattling the windows, the creaking of the wood, the silent footsteps of someone walking through the corridors. She thought of screaming, of breaking a window, of doing anything to attract attention, but she knew it would be interpreted as an outburst, as mental confusion from an elderly woman. Helen had been planting these seeds for months. The staff, all loyal to her, would testify whatever their mistress ordered. Richard was thousands of miles away. Mrs. Eleanor was alone. Monday morning dawned with a grey sky over Beverly Hills. Helen was particularly cheerful, talking on the phone while sipping her espresso. When she hung up, she announced to the staff that she had hired a professional caregiver to assist with Mrs. Eleanor's care. "My mother-in-law needs specialized attention, and I can't be dedicated to her 24 hours a day. I have my own commitments. The professional arrives this afternoon." Mrs. Eleanor heard the announcement with a mixture of hope and apprehension. A new person in the house could be an ally, someone who would see what was happening, or it could just be another piece in Helen's game, another person loyal to her daughter-in-law, and not to her. The day dragged on slowly until at 3 in the afternoon the doorbell rang. Marina Smith was 36 years old and carried in her eyes the experience of someone who had seen a lot in life. A nursing graduate from Oxford University, she had worked for over 10 years as a caregiver for the elderly, always choosing her cases carefully. She didn't accept just any job. She needed to feel that she could make a real difference in her patients' lives. When Helen contacted her through a specialized agency, Marina did her research. The Vance family was well known, rich, influential. The payment offered was generous. But there was something in Helen's tone of voice during the phone interview that put Marina on alert. A coldness disguised as concern. Helen greeted Marina with a wide smile and a firm handshake. She led her through the mansion, explaining the routine, showing where the medications were kept, describing the strict schedules that should be followed. Mrs. Eleanor has her moments of confusion. You know how it is at this age. It's important to be firm, maintain the routine, not let her do things that could put her at risk. I trust you will handle this professionally. Marina merely nodded, but her mind was already registering details. The way Helen spoke about her mother-in-law, as if she were a burden, the excessive amount of listed medications, the rigidity of the schedules, the locked rooms, the security cameras everywhere except strangely in Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom. Something didn't add up. When she was finally introduced to her patient, Marina felt a pang in her chest. Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in an armchair near the window, looking out at the garden with an expression of deep sadness. Her eyes, however, still shone with intelligence and lucidity. There was no confusion there was fear. Marina recognized that look. She had seen it before, in other patients, in other homes. It was the look of someone trapped in a vulnerable situation, voiceless, powerless. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor. My name is Marina, and I'll be taking care of you starting today. I'm sure we'll get along very well." Marina spoke with genuine kindness, sitting in the other armchair and maintaining a respectful distance. Mrs. Eleanor slowly turned to face her. She studied Marina's face for long seconds, as if trying to decipher if she could trust this woman. Finally, she spoke in a low but firm voice. "Do you work for her or for me?" The question took Marina by surprise. It was direct, cutting, loaded with meaning. Before she could answer, Helen entered the room without knocking. "I hope you're getting acquainted. Marina, remember what we discussed. Any problem, any strange behavior from Mrs. Eleanor, you tell me immediately." And with that she left, leaving the door ajar. Marina waited a few seconds and then answered Mrs. Eleanor's question in a low voice. "I work for you, Mrs. Eleanor. I always work for my patients." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. In the following days, Marina observed everything with meticulous attention. The way Helen administered the medications, always alone, always in a hurry. The way the staff avoided eye contact with Mrs. Eleanor, the doors that remained locked, the interrupted conversations, and most importantly, she observed her patient. Mrs. Eleanor was not confused. Her memory was sharp, her stories coherent, her perception of reality absolutely lucid. She knew the day of the week, remembered recent events in detail, and conversed, with perfect articulation. When Marina asked about her medications, Mrs. Eleanor listed each one, their correct dosages, how long she had been taking them. But she also mentioned that lately she had been feeling different, too drowsy, dizzy, without reason. Marina began to make discreet notes in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. She recorded times, symptoms, behaviors. One night, when Helen brought Mrs. Eleanor's medications, Marina asked to see the boxes, under the excuse of needing to better understand the remedies. Helen hesitated but couldn't refuse without appearing suspicious. She showed the boxes quickly but did not allow Marina to hold them. In that brief glance, Marina noticed something strange. One of the medications was a strong anxiolytic, not prescribed for the elderly except in very specific cases. Another was a high-dose sleeping aid. Neither of them was on the list Mrs. Eleanor had mentioned. Marina felt a chill down her spine. Helen was medicating her mother-in-law with unprescribed drugs, probably to keep her sedated, confused, controllable. The caregiver knew she needed more concrete proof. She couldn't make accusations based solely on suspicion, so she made a risky decision. She bought a tiny button-sized camera online, capable of recording and transmitting images to her cell phone. She waited for an afternoon when Helen was out for a social engagement and installed the camera inside the crystal lamp that sat on the nightstand next to Mrs. Eleanor's bed. From there, it would capture everything that happened in the room. She didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, around 10 o'clock, Helen entered Mrs. Eleanor's room with the medication tray. Marina had been dismissed earlier, under the excuse that the family needed privacy, but the camera was recording, and what it captured made Marina's blood boil. Helen threw the pills in front of Mrs. Eleanor with disdain. "Take this quickly, old woman. I'm tired of pretending to care. You're a nuisance, always have been. Richard should never have brought you here." Her mother-in-law tried to recoil, but Helen held her arm tightly. "You're going to take these pills every day. You're going to stay quiet in your corner, and you're going to stop trying to talk to my husband. Understood? Because if you keep trying to cause trouble, I guarantee things will get much worse for you." "You're crazy. I'll tell Richard everything." Mrs. Eleanor tried to break free, her voice trembling but defiant. Helen laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Tell, who will believe you? You're old, confused, senile. Everyone already knows that. I've planted that idea in the head of every person in this house, including your dear son. You're invisible, Mrs. Eleanor. No one hears you, no one sees you. You'll get out of the way, one way or another." Mrs. Eleanor swallowed the pills with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Helen left the room without looking back. The recording captured everything. When Marina watched the video the next morning, she felt a mixture of anger and determination. Now she had proof, but she knew she had to act carefully. Helen was powerful, well-connected, and would certainly react violently if she felt threatened. Marina searched the internet for elder protection organizations and found the contact for Julia Meadows, a social worker specializing in cases of psychological abuse and neglect. She sent an email explaining the situation, attaching excerpts from the video and asking for guidance. Julia responded in a few hours, requesting an urgent meeting. They met in a discreet cafe in downtown London, far from Beverly Hills. Julia was 50 years old, with grey hair pulled back in a bun and a serious expression that inspired confidence. She had dealt with dozens of similar cases throughout her career, but each one still impacted her deeply. Julia watched the video 3 times, her face growing more serious with each viewing. When she finished, she took a deep breath and looked at Marina with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You did the right thing by contacting me. This is a clear case of psychological abuse and neglect. But I need to warn you, cases involving wealthy and influential families are complicated. They have lawyers, connections, power. We'll need to build a solid case before we act." Marina nodded. "I know, that's why I'm collecting everything I can." Julia picked up her tablet and began taking notes. "We need more evidence. Photos of the medications, copies of prescriptions if you can get them, records of the moments Mrs. Eleanor tries to communicate with her son and is prevented. And we need to involve the right authorities. I know someone who can help." Julia made a call right there, speaking to a contact at the Elder Abuse Unit at Scotland Yard. On the other end of the line was Detective Maurice Sterling, a 52-year-old man who had dedicated his entire career to cases involving vulnerable individuals. Maurice had a peculiar reputation within the force. He was competent, dedicated, but also known for trusting his instincts too much and for having made a significant mistake in the past that had tarnished his image. 3 years earlier, he had investigated a case of alleged fraud at a nursing home and arrested the administrator based on testimonies that later proved false. The man spent 2 months in prison before the truth came to light. Since then, Maurice was viewed with suspicion by some colleagues, always having to prove twice as much to be taken seriously. But Julia knew the real Maurice. He was incorruptible, persistent, and genuinely concerned about victims. When she explained Mrs. Eleanor's case, Maurice didn't hesitate. "I'll take on this investigation. Send me everything you have and tell the caregiver to continue documenting, but very carefully. If this Helen Drummond is as dangerous as she seems, she won't hesitate to retaliate." Marina returned to the mansion that afternoon with a new determination. She knew she was taking risks, that Helen could discover her at any moment, but she couldn't abandon Mrs. Eleanor. In the following days, she continued her normal care routine, but always attentive, always recording. She took discreet photos of the medication boxes when Helen wasn't around. She recorded conversations where the staff commented, without realizing the gravity, on how their mistress had ordered the lock on Mrs. Eleanor's room to be changed to one that could be locked from the outside. It was during one of these silent investigations that Marina made a disturbing discovery. One Saturday afternoon, while accompanying Mrs. Eleanor on a stroll through the back of the garden, she noticed something strange in an arbor covered with climbing plants. There was a constant movement, a low but persistent buzzing. She approached carefully and froze. It was an enormous wasp nest, perhaps the largest she had ever seen. The wasps entered and exited in a constant flow, aggressive, territorial. "Mrs. Eleanor, let's go back another way. It's dangerous here." Marina tried to lead her patient away, but the elderly woman had also noticed the nest, and a shiver ran down her spine. That arbor used to be one of her favorite spots when she visited the house before moving in. It was secluded, peaceful, perfect for reading. Now it was taken over by those dangerous creatures. That night, Marina couldn't get the image of the nest out of her head. There was something deeply unsettling about its presence. The next day, a Sunday, while Helen was at brunch with friends, Marina decided to explore areas of the house that were normally off-limits to her. She went up to the attic, searched cupboards in the basement, looking for anything that might be relevant. And it was in a locked cupboard in the back storage room that she found something that made her heart pound. Using a key she had seen discreetly hanging on a bulletin board in the laundry room, Marina opened the cupboard. Inside was a complete beekeeper's suit, new, unused, but clearly recently purchased. Along with it, she found strong nylon ropes, thick gloves, and a long stick with an adapted tip, as if made to reach something high. There was also a vial of wasp pheromone used to attract or agitate hives. Marina took photos of everything with trembling hands. Her brain worked frantically, trying to understand what it meant. When she connected the dots, the giant nest, the protective suit, the ropes, the stick, Helen's coldness, the veiled threats, Marina felt a chill run through her entire body. Helen was planning something horrible, something that would involve exposing Mrs. Eleanor to that wasp nest, something that would look like a tragic accident, but would be carefully orchestrated. The cruelty of the plan was almost unbelievable, but the evidence was there, concrete, irrefutable. Marina left the storage room with shaky legs and went straight to her car parked in the staff area. She called Julia immediately. "I found something very serious. I think she's planning to seriously harm Mrs. Eleanor." She explained everything she had seen, sent the photos. Julia, on the other end of the line, was silent for a few seconds. "This is very serious, Marina. I'm going to contact Detective Maurice right now. You need to file an official report as soon as possible." That same afternoon, Julia and Marina met with Maurice Sterling in his office at the police station. The detective methodically examined all the evidence, the video of the threats, the photos of the medications, the records of isolation, and finally the images of the beekeeper's suit and the wasp nest. His face grew darker and darker. "This is a delicate investigation. We're talking about a possible premeditated attempt to cause serious harm to a vulnerable person. But I have to be honest with you. My credibility in the force isn't the best. I'll need everything very well documented with no room for error." Maurice had a constant companion in his investigations, a German shepherd named Thor, whom he had adopted from a shelter years ago. Thor had been trained to sniff out drugs, but he had a special talent that Maurice had learned to trust, a keen sensitivity to detect human fear, extreme anxiety, and dangerous situations. The dog accompanied the detective on many of his investigations, and his presence always brought a strange comfort to traumatized victims. "I'll set up a discreet surveillance operation. I need to catch this woman red-handed, or at least gather irrefutable evidence before acting. Families like the Vances have resources to bury investigations, to pressure authorities. I can't make a mistake this time." Maurice spoke with steely determination, but Marina noticed the vulnerability in his eyes, the weight of the past mistake he carried like an invisible scar. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Helen began to feel that something was wrong. Marina was too competent, too attentive, asked too many questions. In recent days, she had noticed the caregiver rummaging in places she shouldn't. She decided it was time to act. She called Marina into her office on Monday morning with a severe expression. "Marina, I appreciate your services, but we'll have to let you go. I'm not satisfied with your performance. You'll receive your full month's pay, but I want you to leave today." Marina tried to argue, but Helen was inflexible. Her dismissal was not a discussion, it was a fact. With a heavy heart, Marina went to Mrs. Eleanor's room to say goodbye. The elderly woman held her hands tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Don't abandon me, please. You're the only one who sees me, the only one who hears me." "I won't abandon you, Mrs. Eleanor. I promise. I'm doing everything I can to get you out of here, trust me." Marina hugged her patient, feeling the fragile body tremble with fear and hope at the same time. When she left the mansion that afternoon, with her box of belongings and the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, Marina knew that time was running out. Helen was accelerating her plans. With Marina out of the mansion, Helen felt free to accelerate her plans. Richard was again on an international trip, this time in Germany, where he was closing important business deals. He would be away for 2 full weeks, and Helen knew this was the perfect time. Without the intrusive caregiver, without her husband nearby, she would have total control over the situation. But what Helen didn't know was that her every move was being monitored. Maurice Sterling obtained judicial authorization to install discreet surveillance cameras around the property, disguised, on lampposts and in small devices hidden in trees near the walls. He also assigned an observation team that rotated in a discreet vehicle parked on the street, documenting everyone who entered and exited. Thor, his German shepherd, was always by the detective's side, alert, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Marina, although officially dismissed, did not give up. She maintained constant contact with Julia and Maurice, providing information about the house's routine, the security guards' shift changes, and the blind spots of the internal security cameras. She also managed, through one of the gardeners who sympathized with Mrs. Eleanor, to receive discreet updates on the elderly woman's condition. The news was worrying. Mrs. Eleanor was increasingly isolated, rarely left her room, and was rapidly losing weight. Helen, in turn, began to execute the final phase of her plan. She started taking Mrs. Eleanor for short walks through the gardens, always towards the back of the property, familiarizing her mother-in-law with that path. She spoke about how the fresh air was good, how important it was to maintain some physical activity, how that corner of the garden was peaceful and beautiful. Mrs. Eleanor went because she had no choice. But her heart raced every time they passed near the arbor, where the nest pulsed with dangerous life. It was on a grey Thursday, with the sky heavy with dark clouds, that Helen received an unexpected call. It was Richard, saying he would end his meetings earlier than expected and return to the UK the following Saturday, instead of in a week. Helen felt panic squeeze her chest. Her time was running out. She needed to act immediately before her husband returned, and her chances of executing the plan diminished. That same night she went down to the back storage room and retrieved the beekeeper's suit, the ropes and the stick. She went upstairs with everything hidden in a large bag and stored it in her closet. She mentally reviewed each step of the plan. The next morning she would convince Mrs. Eleanor to take another walk, claiming it would be good for her before the weather worsened. She would lead her mother-in-law to the arbor, offer her to sit in the iron chair that was there, bolted to the ground. Then, with some excuse, she would discreetly tie the elderly woman, put on the protective suit, and provoke the nest. The wasps would relentlessly attack Mrs. Eleanor. Helen, protected, would wait long enough to ensure the damage was significant. Then she would feign a desperate rescue, call for help, playing the devoted wife who tried to save her mother-in-law from a terrible accident. Helen spent the night awake, rehearsing every movement, every word, every facial expression she would use afterward. She was a master at playing roles, at building convincing narratives. This would be no different. When the sun rose on Friday, a weak sun that barely penetrated the dense clouds, Helen calmly drank her coffee, dressed in light, comfortable clothes, and went up to Mrs. Eleanor's room. The elderly woman was sitting in her armchair, looking out the window with that distant expression that had become constant. She had barely slept in recent weeks, tormented by nightmares where she was pursued by black swarms and deafening buzzing. When Helen entered without knocking, Mrs. Eleanor felt her entire body tense. There was something different in her daughter-in-law's gaze, a cold determination, a decision made. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. How about we take a walk in the garden? The weather will get worse this afternoon, so it's best we take advantage now. Come, I'll help you get dressed." Helen's voice was mechanical, without the pretense of kindness she had once maintained. Mrs. Eleanor wanted to refuse, her instinct screaming that something terrible was about to happen, but she knew she had no choice. Helen helped her put on a light coat, put on her comfortable shoes, and held her arm firmly as they went down the stairs. The staff present lowered their eyes, pretending not to see. Everyone knew something was wrong in that house, but no one had the courage to oppose their mistress. As Helen led Mrs. Eleanor through the gardens, towards the back of the property, Maurice Sterling was in his observation vehicle, located 3 blocks away, monitoring the installed cameras. One of the cameras, positioned in a tall tree near the back walls, captured the image of the 2 women walking towards the arbor. Maurice felt his police instinct trigger alarms. "Something is happening right now," he told Julia, who was beside him, and the 2 officers accompanying him. Thor, in the back seat, began to get restless, growling softly. Marina, who was at home but receiving updates by phone, felt her heart pound. "Hits now, she's going to do it now, please get there in time." Her voice trembled with desperation. Maurice started the engine, alerted his support team, and drove towards the mansion, the siren lights still off so as not to alert Helen prematurely. In the garden, Helen had led Mrs. Eleanor to the arbor. The iron chair was there, partially covered by dry leaves, but still solid, bolted to the ground by old screws. The nest was immense, vibrant, dangerous. "Sit here, Mrs. Eleanor. Rest a little while I go get us a drink." Helen spoke with frightening calm. Mrs. Eleanor looked at the chair, at the nest above it, and understood with absolute clarity what was about to happen. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably. "No, I won't sit. Please, Helen, don't do this." She tried to recoil, but Helen held her with surprising force. "You have no choice. Sit down now." Helen pushed her mother-in-law into the chair, forcing her to sit. Mrs. Eleanor began to scream, to call for help, but her voice was weak, muffled by the distance from the main house and the sound of the wind in the trees. Helen pulled out the ropes she had hidden in her coat pocket and began to tie her mother-in-law's wrists to the chair frame, working with the practiced movements of someone who had rehearsed them many times. Mrs. Eleanor cried desperately, pleading, trying to break free, but she was too weak and Helen was relentless. When she finished tying her, Helen stepped back, observing her handiwork with cold satisfaction. "You should have stayed silent. You should have accepted your place. But no. You had to try to cling to Richard, try to maintain your influence over him. Now you'll pay for it." Helen ran back to the rear of the house, entered through the pantry door and quickly went up to her closet. She put on the beekeeper's suit with hurried but precise movements. The suit covered her entire body, the helmet protected her face, the thick gloves protected her hands. She grabbed the adapted stick and the pheromone vial. She was ready. She went down again and walked back to the arbor, where Mrs. Eleanor remained tied, struggling uselessly against the ropes, her face wet with tears and sweat. It was at that exact moment that Maurice and his team arrived at the mansion gate. The detective identified himself at the intercom, his voice firm and authoritative, demanding immediate entry. The security guard hesitated, but the presence of 3 police cars and Maurice's urgent tone convinced him to open. The vehicles sped down the long driveway leading to the main mansion. Maurice had already studied the property map Marina had provided and knew exactly where the back of the garden was. With Marina out of the mansion, Helen felt free to accelerate her plans. Richard was again on an international trip, this time in Germany, where he was closing important business deals. He would be away for 2 full weeks, and Helen knew this was the perfect time. Without the intrusive caregiver, without her husband nearby, she would have total control over the situation. But what Helen didn't know was that her every move was being monitored. Maurice Sterling obtained judicial authorization to install discreet surveillance cameras around the property, disguised on lampposts and in small devices hidden in trees near the walls. He also assigned an observation team that rotated in a discreet vehicle parked on the street, documenting everyone who entered and exited. Thor, his German shepherd, was always by the detective's side, alert, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Marina, although officially dismissed, did not give up. She maintained constant contact with Julia and Maurice, providing information about the house's routine, the security guards' shift changes, and the blind spots of the internal security cameras. She also managed, through one of the gardeners who sympathized with Mrs. Eleanor, to receive discreet updates on the elderly woman's condition. The news was worrying. Mrs. Eleanor was increasingly isolated, rarely left her room and was rapidly losing weight. Helen, in turn, began to execute the final phase of her plan. She started taking Mrs. Eleanor for short walks through the gardens, always towards the back of the property, familiarizing her mother-in-law with that path. She spoke about how the fresh air was good, how important it was to maintain some physical activity, how that corner of the garden was peaceful and beautiful. Mrs. Eleanor went because she had no choice, but her heart raced every time they passed near the arbor, where the nest pulsed with dangerous life. It was on a grey Thursday, with the sky heavy with dark clouds, that Helen received an unexpected call. It was Richard saying he would end his meetings earlier than expected and return to the UK the following Saturday. instead of in a week. Helen felt panic squeeze her chest. Her time was running out. She needed to act immediately, before her husband returned, and her chances of executing the plan diminished. That same night, she went down to the back storage room and retrieved the beekeeper's suit, the ropes, and the stick. She went upstairs with everything hidden in a large bag and stored it in her closet. She mentally reviewed each step of the plan. The next morning she would convince Mrs. Eleanor to take another walk, claiming it would be good for her before the weather worsened. She would lead her mother-in-law to the arbor, offer her to sit in the iron chair that was there, bolted to the ground. Then, with some excuse, she would discreetly tie the elderly woman, put on the protective suit and provoke the nest. The wasps would relentlessly attack Mrs. Eleanor. Helen, protected, would wait long enough to ensure the damage was significant. Then she would feign a desperate rescue, call for help, playing the devoted wife who tried to save her mother-in-law from a terrible accident. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and transformations. Helen was formally charged and remained in custody, facing multiple serious accusations. The media covered the case voraciously. The scandal of a millionaire businessman's wife who had deliberately planned to harm her elderly mother-in-law dominated headlines for weeks. Journalists camped in front of the police station, cameras and microphones vying for every sordid detail of the story. Richard refused to give interviews, focusing all his energy on caring for his mother and understanding how he had failed so gravely. Mrs. Eleanor was hospitalized for 3 days for observation. Doctors confirmed that physically she was well, but recommended intensive psychological counseling to process the trauma. Richard did not leave her side for a moment. He slept in an uncomfortable chair next to the hospital bed, held her hand during nightly anxiety attacks, and listened patiently as she recounted the months of isolation and fear. Every word his mother spoke was a stab to his heart, a painful reminder of his own blindness and negligence. When she was finally discharged and returned home, the mansion was unrecognizable. Richard had fired all the staff Helen had hired and brought back, those who had worked for the family for years. The cook, who had been dismissed months earlier, returned with tears of joy upon reuniting with Mrs. Eleanor. The gardener, whom Helen had replaced with someone younger, returned and immediately arranged for the wasp nest to be safely removed by specialized professionals. The iron chair in the arbor was destroyed, broken into pieces, and discarded as if it were a cursed symbol of a nightmare that had finally ended. Richard transformed the room that once belonged to Helen into a private living room for his mother, with shelves full of books, a comfortable armchair positioned before a large window overlooking the garden, and a grand piano that Mrs. Eleanor had played in her youth but hadn't touched for decades. He spent weeks restoring every corner of the house, erasing the traces of Helen's presence, rebuilding a space that was truly welcoming for his mother. But the most important reconstruction was not physical, it was emotional. Richard needed to regain his mother's trust. He needed to prove that he would never abandon her again, that he would never again put anything above her. So he made a radical decision. He handed over the operational management of the company to his trusted partner and took on a consulting position that allowed him to work from home. He cancelled all international trips for the next 6 months. He completely reorganized his priorities. Every morning, he had coffee with Mrs. Eleanor on the sunny veranda, talking about everything and nothing. She told stories of her childhood, of when Richard was little, of her late husband. He listened with genuine attention, laughing at funny anecdotes moved by touching memories. For the first time in years, they were truly present for each other, without haste, without interruptions, without masks. Marina was invited to return, but this time not as a hired caregiver, but as a family friend. Richard offered her a director position in a new project he was conceptualizing, an institute dedicated to the protection of vulnerable elderly individuals. Marina, using all her experience as a nurse and caregiver, began to structure training programs to identify signs of abuse, secure reporting systems, and support networks for victims. The institute received generous funding from Richard and quickly gained recognition as a benchmark in the field. Julia Meadows, the social worker who had been instrumental in solving the Case was invited to be a permanent consultant for the institute. She brought all her expertise in cases of psychological abuse and helped develop protocols that could be replicated in other cities. Their work would save many lives in the years that followed, invisible people who would finally have a voice and protection. Maurice Sterling experienced a moment of profound redemption. The case that could have been another failure became his most significant victory. His competence and dedication were publicly recognized, and he received a well-deserved promotion. But what touched him most was Mrs. Eleanor's personal thanks, who hugged him, with tears in her eyes, and said that he had given her back not only her freedom, but her dignity. Thor, his faithful German shepherd, officially became the force's first emotional support dog, participating in sensitive operations and bringing comfort to traumatized victims. Helen's trial was long and painful. Her lawyer tried to argue that she suffered from psychological disorders, that she was not fully aware of her actions. But the evidence was irrefutable. The videos showed clear premeditation, the documented threats revealed calculated cruelty, and the apparatus prepared for the execution of the plan demonstrated shocking coldness. Helen was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to years of incarceration in a closed regime, in addition to mandatory psychiatric treatment. She never showed genuine remorse, and Richard never wanted to see her again. The divorce was processed quickly. Richard waived any attempt to recover assets that had been transferred to Helen's name during the marriage. He only wanted distance. He wanted to erase that terrible chapter from his life. But the lessons were permanently etched into his soul. He had learned in the worst possible way that appearances are deceiving, that professional success is worth nothing if it comes with emotional abandonment, that true family needs presence, attention, and constant protection. Mrs. Eleanor, despite the deep trauma, showed surprising resilience. With the support of weekly therapy, her son's renewed love, the companionship of Marina, and the staff who genuinely cared for her, she began to recover. The sparkle slowly returned to her eyes. Her smile, shy at first, became more frequent. She started playing the piano again, her fingers trembling at first, but increasingly confident. The music that echoed through the house was a symbol of healing, of new beginnings, of victory over darkness. Richard began organizing weekly dinners, inviting not only Marina and Julia, but also Maurice and even some of the police officers who participated in the rescue. These people, who started as strangers in a crisis situation, became an extended family, united by an experience that had permanently changed them all. They shared meals, laughter, and stories, building positive memories that slowly replaced the shadows of the past. One spring evening, exactly 1 year after the rescue, Richard hosted a special dinner. The table was set with fine linens, fresh garden flowers, and candles that cast a soft, welcoming glow. All the guests arrived elegantly dressed, but the atmosphere was one of relaxation and genuine joy. When everyone was seated, Richard stood up holding a wine glass and called for silence. "I want to make a toast. A year ago, I almost lost the most important person in my life because I was blind, arrogant, and negligent. I believed in appearances, ignored signs, prioritized the wrong things. But thanks to extraordinary people present here today, people who had courage when I didn't, who saw when I was blind, who acted when I was absent, my mother is here today, alive, safe, and recovering. Marina, Julia, Maurice, Thor, and everyone who participated in this journey. You didn't just save a life, you saved an entire family. You saved me from myself. So this toast is for you, with my eternal gratitude. And it's for my mother, the strongest woman I know, who survived the unimaginable and still finds the strength to smile, to forgive, to start anew. I love you, Mom." Mrs. Eleanor also stood up, emotional, and hugged her son for a long time. When they separated, she picked up her own glass and said in a firm voice, "And I toast to second chances, to the discovery that even in the worst situations, there are still good people, people who care, people who make a difference. May this story, however painful it was, serve as a warning and a hope for others who are going through similar situations. No one else needs to suffer in silence." Everyone raised their glasses and toasted, a moment of unity and celebration that sealed the complete transformation of that house, that family, those lives. The garden, which had been the scene of so much fear and pain, was now a space of peace. The arbor was rebuilt with colorful, climbing flowers, a comfortable wooden bench, and a small discreet plaque that simply read, "Always watch, always care, always protect." The following months were of consolidation. The institute led by Marina grew, opening branches in other cities, training hundreds of professionals, rescuing dozens of elderly people from abusive situations. Richard became a public advocate for the cause, using his influence and resources to lobby for stricter laws to protect vulnerable individuals. Maurice continued his work at the police station, now respected and valued, with Thor always by his side. Mrs. Eleanor, finally free, finally heard, finally safe, lived her days with a serenity she hadn't felt in years. She knew that the trauma would never completely disappear, that there would be difficult days and occasional nightmares. But she also knew that she was no longer alone, that she had a solid support network, that her voice mattered. And that made all the difference. The story of the Vance family ceased to be a scandal, to become a symbol of warning, redemption, and reparation. Amidst the pain, a new cycle was born, silent but true, and this time no one else would be silenced. The mansion in Beverly Hills, which for so long had been a golden prison, transformed into a true home where love, respect, and dignity finally prevailed. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Mrs. Eleanor, Richard, Marina, and all who fought for the truth has deeply touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that vigilance and care for our loved ones must never be neglected, and that even in the darkest situations, there is always hope when courageous people decide to act. To continue experiencing intense emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other incredible stories that explore the complexity of human relationships, redemption, and the strength that exists within each of us. Find this playlist by clicking here on the side. If this story of overcoming and starting anew resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us continue bringing narratives that matter. Every day we share unique stories that make us reflect on life, on our choices, and on the transformative power of love and courage. Tell us in the comments what you thought of this journey of the Vance family, your reflections on the theme, and what other stories you would like to hear. Your participation is fundamental to our community. We await you in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.